want to think about resistance in two basic forms as a saxophone player. One is air resistance or air pressure, and the other is embouchure. So air pressure is generally horizontal, where embouchure pressure is this kind of vertical thing. So ideally, you want to be able to adjust where that is, finding that sweet spot, moving your embouchure more forward and relaxed, allowing the reed to oscillate with maximum efficiency. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about resistance. Not so much with a guitar. However, when we as horn players are talking about resistance, what exactly do we mean when we say that? For a stringed instrument, it's really about the tension that's in the strings, how hard it is to press it in order to get a note to come out. That's not too different from being a saxophone player. Yeah. All right, you guys can see that I'm rocking the fro. Usually when I have it just blue behind me like this, I just rock the fro. But if I start using the blue screen, it gets weird with the light in my hair and it gets all grayed out and it just looks very strange. So I've been throwing that hat on and whatever, but just wanted to explain that because some of you guys are like, where's the fro, man? Did you cut it? No. On a side note, I was working on a cruise ship and I was going out of a place where I could regularly get haircuts from people that I trust, because in my culture, that is a big deal. We generally don't just rock up to a place and get a haircut. Like, we don't just go to the mall and get a haircut. You know, it's like, I don't know this dude. You know what I'm saying? I just couldn't find a place to get my haircut, so I just didn't cut it. And then I wound up back in the place where I could get my haircut. Well, then I just didn't have time to do it. And by that time, I was like, you know, I might as well just rock the fro. I'm in Florida and it's like 1,000 million degrees with 100 billion degrees percentage humidity and whatnot. And then I'm going to the Caribbean. Then we're there at the hottest point of the day. And I was just like, you know, it might be time to cut this. Now I'm back in Ohio. So I guess I'm glad I kept it. Little fro story for you. This is my flute, ladies and gentlemen. It is actually a really, really good flute, especially for the price that I paid for it. This is the Mio flute by Cannonball. But I never really settled into this flute, mainly because of the way the head joint is. Now, some people just like head joints cut the way this one is, just like some people like mouthpieces that are cut a certain way. But this one has just always been weirdly resistant for the way that I've chosen to play a flute. And I've played some really, really good Yamahas. I've played some cheap Yamahas, played some $8,000 Pearl flutes where I just did not have those types of issues. So at some point, I'm probably going to wind up getting a new flute. But even with flute, any kind of wind instrument, you're going to wind up having to deal with some type of resistance. Okay? All right. I've frequently spoken about soprano saxophone, and with the octave key, once you get above that G sharp, how the other octave mechanism, the other vent engages, because the original saxophones had two different octave mechanisms on the back, but this is an automatic system that every saxophone has now. But where soprano saxophones go wrong for me is this phenomenal amount of resistance and back pressure once you get above that note. And I think that soprano saxophone manufacturers are pretty much doing this on purpose, because it is kind of a cheap way of helping to fix intonation issues with the instrument. But it's done at the cost of applying so much back pressure that in general, for me at least, it makes the instrument unplayable. It's taken me a long time to find an instrument that I was really comfortable with. the original Yamaha 62 Sopranos. The Yamaha 62 Sopranos were absolutely fantastic. A lot of vintage Sopranos didn't have this issue. I think that as Soprano just became more and more popular, this was something that a lot of them just worked into the instruments. A lot of people, they weren't really saxophonists to begin with, that were learning on soprano, so they wouldn't have even recognized that this problem exists, which definitely, to me, is the biggest reason why soprano saxophone is actually considered to be a fantastically difficult saxophone to play in tune and to learn on. Most people will not recommend that you start learning on soprano saxophone because of those resistance issues. How hard do I have to blow into this thing in order to get the reed to oscillate? Notice I'm using the word oscillate because it's a much better word than vibrate when we're talking about the reed's motion. When the reed is oscillating, the air is vibrating, the entire saxophone is vibrating, your face is vibrating, and by extension, whatever's connected to anything that is set into oscillation is also vibrating. But we want to understand how much energy we have to apply to something in order for it to move. Now, in science, we generally refer to its mass, how much energy it takes to get something to not be at rest. We refer to the reed's ability to resist movement or oscillating by its strength number, which is generally from 1 to 5. I don't know of any reeds that are like more than a 5, or why anybody would be foolish enough to even try to play something like that. But the higher the number, the harder it is to get this thing to oscillate. There are attributes of a mouthpiece that greatly determine how that actually feels, to a point where the actual number of the reed becomes arbitrary. So the tip opening of the mouthpiece, the facing length, the facing curve, these things are paramount, and also how aggressive the mouthpiece is baffled. Generally, with a very high baffled mouthpiece, the mouthpiece feels like it has a much smaller tip opening or less resistance. So another thing you may hear when people talk about resistance is back pressure. We're really just using it to mean the same thing. They're technically not the same thing, but we always use it to be the same thing. Another thing that you hear in terms of mouthpieces is facings versus tip openings. We shouldn't be mixing those up. I've tried to stop doing that over the last few years because I was just throwing it together interchangeably. But generally, whenever you hear somebody talking about mouthpieces, tip openings and facings, they're generally referring to them as being the same thing. So the facing generally refers to the length of the facing. I'll explain that. And the facing curve. So the length of the facing is how long to the tip where the mouthpiece actually creates separation from the reed. That point where the reed separates from the mouthpiece is the starting point up to the tip. And the curve is just everything. The curve isn't always the same for every mouthpiece. So the facing length, the facing curve, the tip opening, your reed strength, and even your reed brand is going to play a big role in what kind of resistance, how much energy you have to apply just to get the thing to oscillate. And if it's really high, you're just going to get really tired and not be able to play. If it's too low, you're not going to get a very good sound, and ultimately you're just going to wind up sealing the reed to the mouthpiece. So let's take a look at what's going on between the length, the facing length, the facing curve, tip opening, and reed strength. All right, let's get to that. Let's take a look at this Autolink Supertone Master 7 mouthpiece. So we take a look, we can see where the reed is actually separating from the mouthpiece all the way up to the tip. And then we can even see about halfway from where that separation point is to the tip. So the further back or the longer the facing length is, the more you are actually engaging the thicker part of the reed. The thicker, more massive part of the reed is going to require more energy in order to manipulate, in order to get moving, and in order to control. So if you have a shorter facing length, with a mouthpiece, you are actively engaging the thinner part of the reed, which is going to be easier to control and thus giving you that desired sound if that's what you're looking for. So there's a lot of variation involved with facing length and the curvature of the facing itself. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I got for you. I hope I could clear up some resistance and back pressure issues for you that you were having with mouthpieces and reeds. All right, that's all I got for you. See ya!